American story, it's a religious story, Congregationalist story, a Unitarian story. When the Puritans first came over here, the Puritans really were a revival movement, right? They were trying to revive what had been Roman Catholicism that became Anglicanism. They were really very excited about the ideas they had religiously, which weren't accepted in England, and so they just propelled themselves across the ocean and they landed here, and they were ignited. And for a while, what was happening here was centered on this spirit, on this fire that they were feeling. So the 1700s felt like, the 1600s, the 17th century felt like it was all about that. As they were sort of trying to figure out how to create a world that mirrored that kind of energy. But by the beginning of the 18th century, that energy had really died, right? Like 100 years later, and they just couldn't keep that going. And really, the smallpox vaccine in 1702 changed a lot. It sort of challenged their whole idea of predestination, this concept that your life has already been predetermined. If there's a vaccine, that kind of things started to get murkier for them. And by the 1730s, churches were pretty empty. Really, people weren't coming to church anymore. It felt like religion was dying. George Whitefield said something like, I wrote the quote down so I don't mess it up. He said, the reason why congregations have been so dead is because dead men preach to them. So he was charging the ministers with the problem. I don't know that he was wrong, but the fact is no one was there. He would go to church and feel like this is a dead space. The minister has nothing to say, and the people don't want to hear it. It looked like the experiment, that Puritan experiment, the congregational experiment, the revival experiment was over. And then something happened. Now, historians can look back and say it kind of started a few years earlier, but the experience for people was that out of nowhere, everything changed. It's what we call the Great Awakening. Out of nowhere. Churches were alive again. People were alive. That whole revival spirit came back. But it was different. It was grounded in these itinerant preachers who were traveling around with this message, a new message. And they were going to places, they weren't going to churches. They were going to fields. They were like putting up tents. People were coming from all over the place. It was intercolonial. It was interdenominational. People were showing up, the Presbyterians and the Methodists, or people who didn't like each other, didn't want to talk to each other, the Anglicans, the Congregationalists, the new weird Baptists, were all showing up. And they were worshiping together in fields. They were bringing their families and spending the summer together. It felt like everything was alive again. It was a spiritual earthquake, and it completely transformed the American landscape. Historians tell us the American Revolution would never have happened without it. That until then, we felt like very separate colonies, and because of the awakening, we felt like a single people. What was once dead was alive in a whole new way. In barns, in fields, in commons. People were hearing a message they needed to hear. It was emotional, it was powerful, it was connective, and it was transformative. It's a story I want us to hold on to today before the sermon. It is the story, you should know, that has often propelled my own ministry. I learned about the awakening a good long time ago in my own studies, and I just have always had this idea that when something feels like it's done, that it can be revived. As long as you're willing to rethink it, reimagine it, let go of everything you think you knew, and start again.